Two people, one from Beijing, one from Berlin, sit down and take a DNA test. On paper, they look nothing alike. Different faces, different histories, different continents. But scientists who've spent decades comparing their genomes have found something that neither one of them would expect. A shared story written in their blood that goes back over 60,000 years. For most of human history, people have looked at the person standing across from them and assumed that difference meant distance. Different skin, different eyes, different language, different food, different gods. It was easy to believe that somewhere far back in time, these two branches of humanity must have started from entirely separate roots. Maybe one group grew out of one patch of earth, and another group grew out of somewhere else entirely, and the two simply never had anything to do with each other until relatively recently. It is a simple story. It is intuitive. It fits the way the world looks on the surface, and it is almost completely wrong. When geneticists actually sat down with the tools to read the human genome letter by letter, comparing samples from Han Chinese populations with samples from European populations, what they found did not confirm the old assumption of separate origins. It dismantled it. The deeper scientists dug, the more the wall between Chinese and European started to look less like a wall and more like a set of footprints left by the same travelers, taking different roads out of the same starting point. That starting point is Africa. This is not speculation, and it is not a modern political statement dressed up as science. It is one of the most thoroughly tested and repeatedly confirmed findings in the entire field of human genetics. Every population on Earth, whether in Stockholm or Shanghai, in Lagos or Lima, carries a genome that traces back to a relatively small population of modern humans who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, a portion of that population began to move. Some of their descendants stayed. Others pushed north and east, out through the region we now call the Middle East, and from there the paths began to split. Not because the travelers were fundamentally different people, but because geography pulled them in different directions. One group of these travelers eventually turned toward the vast plains and river valleys of Europe. Another group kept moving east, following coastlines and river systems for thousands of years, eventually reaching the land that is now China. And here's the detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. These two groups, the ancestors of modern Europeans and the ancestors of modern Chinese populations, were, for a significant stretch of that journey, essentially the same expanding population. They shared campsites. They shared hunting grounds. In some cases, they very likely shared each other's company for generations before their paths permanently diverged. The genetic evidence for this shared corridor of migration is written directly into the DNA of people living today, in Europe and in East Asia alike. One of the clearest windows into this shared past came from a cave near Beijing. In the early 20th century, researchers working at a site called Tianyuan Cave uncovered ancient human remains, and decades later, using techniques that would have sounded like science fiction to the original excavators, geneticists managed to extract and sequence DNA from a roughly 40,000-year-old individual found there. This was a landmark moment. It was one of the first times scientists had a genome-wide look at an early modern human from East Asia, filling in a gap in the human story that had been frustratingly empty for a long time. What the Tianyuan genome revealed was remarkable on more than one level. First, it confirmed that this individual was genetically closer to modern East Asian populations than to modern Europeans, which makes sense given where the remains were found and roughly how long ago this person lived. But the second finding is the one that tends to stop people in their tracks. Buried in that ancient genome was a genetic connection to European individuals from roughly the same time period. Ancient remains found in places like Belgium and Bulgaria. Somehow, an ancient person living near what is now Beijing carried DNA linking them to people living thousands of miles away in what is now Europe, during the exact same slice of prehistory. The most likely explanation researchers have proposed is tied to a wave of culture and technology that swept across a huge stretch of Eurasia during that era. A set of tool-making traditions archaeologists refer to as aureination. The people carrying these tools and traditions moved and mixed across enormous distances long before anyone had drawn a map, long before anyone had a concept of nations or ethnic boundaries. The genetic echo of that movement is still detectable, tens of thousands of years later, in the DNA of an ancient skeleton pulled from a cave floor. There is another thread running through this story that ties Chinese and European genomes together in a way most people have never heard of, and it involves a species of human that no longer exists. Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually disappearing as a distinct population roughly 40,000 years ago. For a long time, scientists assumed that Neanderthals and the modern humans migrating out of Africa were simply competitors, two different species crossing paths without much else happening between them. Then genome sequencing changed everything. It turns out that when modern humans, expanding out of Africa, encountered Neanderthal populations somewhere in the Middle East, they did not just compete for resources, they interbred. And the genetic proof of that encounter is still sitting inside the cells of people alive right now, both in Europe and in East Asia. Modern Chinese populations and modern European populations both carry somewhere in the range of 4 to 5% Neanderthal DNA, a nearly identical percentage passed down independently through both lineages. This shared genetic inheritance did not happen twice, separately by coincidence. It happened once, in a single population of early modern humans who mixed with Neanderthals before that population later split into the ancestors of today's Europeans and the ancestors of today's East Asians. Think about what that actually means. Every time someone frames Chinese and European people as belonging to fundamentally separate, ancient, unrelated lineages, they are ignoring a piece of shared ancestry, quite literally encoded into the DNA of both populations, inherited from the exact same ancient interbreeding event, thousands of generations before either group had ever heard of the other's existence in any meaningful cultural sense. So if the ancestors of Chinese and European populations left Africa together, traveled together for a stretch, and even picked up the same ancient genetic hitchhikers from Neanderthal ancestors along the way, why do people look so different today? This is where the story shifts from ancient shared history to the much more recent, much more localized process of adaptation. After these populations separated and settled into radically different environments, natural selection got to work, but it worked on a comparatively small slice of the genome. The version of a gene that helps regulate skin pigmentation, for instance, responded to how much sunlight a population's environment provided. Populations that settled in regions with less intense, less consistent sunlight tended to evolve lighter skin over many thousands of years, because lighter skin allows more ultraviolet light to be absorbed for vitamin D production in low sunlight environments. Populations that remained in or moved toward regions with intense year-round sun retained darker pigmentation, which offers better protection against UV damage. Eye shape, certain facial features, and other visible traits followed similarly localized evolutionary paths, shaped by climate, diet, and other regional pressures. Here's the number that tends to genuinely surprise people once they hear it. Across the entire human genome, only a very small fraction of our DNA, roughly 0.1%, differs meaningfully between any two individuals selected at random from anywhere on the planet. And within that already tiny sliver of variation, the overwhelming majority of it exists within populations, not between them. In plain terms, there's more genetic variation among people living in a single Chinese province than there is, on average, between broad continental population groups. The traits people use to sort humans into visually distinct categories, skin tone, eye shape, hair texture, are real, but they represent a remarkably small, remarkably recent, and remarkably shallow layer sitting on top of an enormous shared genetic foundation. This finding did not come from a single study or a single lab. It has been replicated again and again using different technologies, different sample sizes, and different research teams working independently of each other, which is exactly the kind of repeated, converging evidence that gives scientists confidence a finding is real rather than a fluke. One of the most ambitious efforts to map Chinese genetic variation in detail came from a large sequencing initiative involving more than 11,000 genomes collected as part of a project studying the genetics of depression in Han Chinese women, a collaboration between researchers in China, the United Kingdom, and the United States. While the project's primary medical goal was understanding a specific health condition, the sheer scale of genomic data it generated turned it into an extraordinary resource for understanding the broader structure of Chinese genetic diversity, and for comparison against reference populations from Europe and elsewhere. Studies drawing on datasets like this one, alongside separate large comparisons using tens of thousands of genetic markers from Han Chinese and European populations, consistently point to the same underlying picture. The two populations are distinguishable. Statistically, researchers can, with enough genetic markers, correctly sort a sample of unlabeled DNA into a Chinese ancestry group or a European ancestry group with a very high degree of accuracy. But being statistically distinguishable is not the same as being fundamentally separate. A skilled analyst can also distinguish between people from northern and southern China using genetic markers, or between people from Scandinavia and people from southern Italy. Fine-grained genetic differences exist at every level of geography, because human populations have been slowly drifting apart, mixing and drifting apart again for tens of thousands of years. None of that fine-grained structure erases the much larger, much older story of common origin sitting underneath it. There's a specific reason scientists care about mapping these genetic differences so carefully, and it has nothing to do with settling arguments about identity or heritage. It has to do with medicine. Certain genetic variants that influence how a person's body processes particular medications differ in frequency between Chinese and European populations. A dosage that works safely for one population might carry higher risks for another population, purely because of differences in how common certain metabolic gene variants are. Without large genetic studies specifically capturing Chinese, European, and other global populations, doctors and researchers would be working with a dangerously incomplete picture, one that historically skewed heavily toward genetic data collected from populations of European descent, leaving major gaps in understanding how diseases and treatments actually function across the full range of human genetic diversity. Every large-scale comparative genome project, in that sense, exists to make medicine safer and more precise for everyone, not to draw lines between groups of people. I'll return to that image from the very beginning, a person from Beijing and a person from Berlin sitting down, comparing results. If you trace their ancestry back roughly 60 to 70,000 years, you would eventually arrive at the same expanding population moving out of Africa. If you traced it back a bit further along that path, you would find their distant ancestors likely crossed through the same regions of the Middle East, quite possibly overlapping with the same Neanderthal populations, leaving both of them with a strikingly similar percentage of ancient Neanderthal DNA still present in their genomes today. If you move forward in time to around 40,000 years ago, you would find genetic threads linking early East Asian populations to early European populations, carried along by shared technology, shared movement, and very likely shared contact between real, living human communities who had no idea their genetic fingerprints would one day be read by machines their descendants hadn't yet imagined. Only in the last few tens of thousands of years, a genuinely small window on the timescale of human evolution, did isolation, distance, and local environmental pressures carve out the visible differences that people today often treat as ancient and unbridgeable. Skin tone adjusted to sunlight. Certain facial features shifted gradually under selective pressures scientists are still working to fully understand. Populations that had once traveled together settled into different corners of a very large world and, over enough centuries, began to look distinctly different on the surface, while remaining, underneath that surface, remarkably alike. This is not a story of division. It is not evidence that one population descended from some entirely separate root, while another population sprang up somewhere else. It is a story of one long, continuous human journey that branched, wandered, adapted, and eventually reconnected. In laboratories, where scientists, sequencing machine by sequencing machine, sample by sample, kept finding the same conclusion no matter how many times they ran the comparison. The differences are real, but they are recent, they are shallow, and they sit on top of a genetic inheritance so deeply shared that, statistically, two strangers from opposite ends of the earth have far more in common in their DNA than either of them likely realizes. To really appreciate how recent this divergence is, it helps to put it next to other timelines people are more familiar with. 60 to 70,000 years might sound impossibly long, almost abstract, but on the scale of biological evolution, it is closer to a blink than a chapter. Complex life on this planet has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Even our own species, in its anatomically modern form, has existed for roughly 200,000 years or more. Against that backdrop, the split between the ancestors of Chinese and European populations happened somewhere in the final third of modern human history, not near the beginning. Most of what makes a human being, the shape of our brains, our capacity for language, our social structures, our tool use, our art, was already firmly in place long before that migration even began. The populations that eventually became distinct groups in East Asia and distinct groups in Europe were not separately evolving into humanity. They were already fully human, carrying nearly the entire genetic and cognitive toolkit people rely on today, before they ever parted ways geographically. This timing matters, because it reframes what these later visible differences actually represent. They are not the echo of some deep evolutionary split between different kinds of humans. They are closer to regional variations, layered onto an already complete, already shared human template, similar in spirit to the way a single spoken language can drift into different dialects and accents once communities separate and stop interacting regularly, without ever becoming different languages entirely. The genome tells a comparable story. Different populations kept the same underlying structure and simply developed regional variations shaped by climate, diet, and chance, long after the fundamentals of being human were already settled. Scientists have also been able to trace roughly how and when specific regional traits emerged by studying variation directly in the genes responsible for them. The gene, most closely associated with lighter skin tone in European populations, for example, appears to have spread relatively recently, likely within the last 10,000 years, closely tracking the shift toward agricultural diets that were lower in vitamin D compared to the varied diets of earlier hunter-gatherer populations. That detail alone reframes the entire conversation. A trait that people often treat as an ancient defining marker of a population turns out to be, on an evolutionary timescale, almost startlingly recent, arriving long after the ancestors of Europeans and the ancestors of East Asians had already gone their separate geographic ways, and long after both groups already shared the vast majority of the genome they still carry today. Comparable stories exist on the East Asian side of the genome. Certain variants associated with hair thickness, sweat gland density, and specific facial features common in East Asian populations also appear to have emerged and spread relatively recently, likely through a process scientists call positive selection, where a particular version of a gene becomes more common quickly because it happens to offer some kind of advantage in a specific environment. Researchers are still working out exactly what advantage some of these traits may have provided, whether related to climate adaptation or, in some cases, possibly linked to broader patterns of mate preference within ancient populations. What remains consistent across all of these findings is the timing. Again and again, the traits that visually distinguish populations today trace back to relatively recent, relatively narrow slices of the genome, arriving long after the deeper, shared migratory history had already been written. There's also a common misconception worth addressing directly: the idea that because Chinese and European populations can be reliably distinguished using genetic testing, this somehow proves they represent deeply separate lineages. Reliable statistical distinction and deep evolutionary separation are simply not the same thing, and conflating them is one of the most persistent sources of confusion in how the public interprets population genetics. Height can reliably distinguish professional basketball players from the general population using nothing but a tape measure, but nobody would argue that professional basketball players represent a separate branch of humanity. Genetic ancestry testing works in a similar way. Given enough genetic markers, and modern testing panels often use hundreds of thousands of them, computers can detect subtle statistical patterns in how frequently certain gene variants appear together within a population. Those patterns are real, and they are useful for legitimate purposes like medical research and historical reconstruction. But detecting a statistical pattern in variant frequency is a world apart from finding evidence of separate biological origin, and serious researchers in the field are consistently careful to draw that distinction, even when popular media coverage blurs it. It is also worth acknowledging why this particular topic, the genetic relationship between Chinese and European populations, keeps resurfacing online in sensational, clickbait-driven formats. Genuine curiosity about human origins is completely natural, and people are right to find this subject fascinating. But that curiosity has also become a target for content designed purely to generate clicks and engagement, using dramatic language about shocking discoveries or hidden truths that mainstream science supposedly overlooked. In reality, the actual findings discussed here, shared African origin, overlapping Neanderthal ancestry, the Tianyuan genome's connection to ancient Europeans, the overwhelming similarity across the human genome, are not secret, suppressed, or new. They come from peer-reviewed research published in respected scientific journals, conducted by research institutions across multiple countries, openly available for anyone willing to look past the sensational headlines and read the actual studies. The real story does not need exaggeration to be compelling. If anything, exaggeration tends to obscure just how remarkable the real findings already are. It's worth pausing on how strange this actually is when you think about human history from the ground up rather than from the headlines. For most of the last several thousand years, the people living in what we now call China and the people living in what we now call Europe had almost no direct contact. Separated by deserts, mountain ranges, and thousands of miles of difficult terrain, these were, for most practical purposes, two civilizations developing largely on their own tracks, building separate languages, separate writing systems, separate philosophies, separate empires. It would be entirely reasonable to assume that this long stretch of separation left an equally deep genetic gap between the two populations. And yet, the genome tells a different story, because the genetic story didn't start with the rise of separate civilizations. It started tens of thousands of years earlier, during a much older, much less documented chapter of human history, when the ancestors of these two future civilizations were still traveling the same roads, before either group had ever built a city, invented writing, or drawn a border on a map. This is part of why ancient DNA research has become one of the most quietly revolutionary fields in modern science. Before genome sequencing became affordable and widespread, historians and anthropologists had to reconstruct these ancient migrations using indirect evidence, tools, pottery styles, skeletal measurements, linguistic patterns. All of that evidence is valuable, but it is also open to interpretation and revision. DNA offers something different, a direct physical record passed down cell by cell, generation by generation, largely immune to the kind of cultural bias that can creep into other forms of historical reconstruction. When a strand of DNA from a person who lived 40,000 years ago tells researchers something about population movement, it isn't offering an opinion. It's reporting a fact written into the molecule itself. That is exactly why findings like the ones drawn from Tianyuan Cave and from large-scale comparisons of modern Chinese and European genomes carry so much weight. They aren't the product of a single dramatic press release designed to shock an audience. They are the product of years of painstaking laboratory work, careful statistical analysis, and independent verification by multiple research teams working in different countries, often without direct coordination, arriving at strikingly consistent conclusions. Real science on this topic tends to look nothing like the dramatic, mysterious, shocking discovery framing that circulates online. It looks like patient incremental progress, one genome at a time, slowly filling in a picture that keeps pointing in the same direction, toward common origin, toward layered but relatively shallow divergence, and toward a shared evolutionary journey that predates every national identity, every language family, and every cultural tradition currently associated with either population. None of this erases the real, meaningful cultural, historical, and social differences that exist between people with Chinese heritage and people with European heritage today. Culture is not written in DNA. Language, cuisine, art, philosophy, family structure, and thousands of years of distinct historical experience are real and profoundly important parts of what makes different societies who they are. Genetics is not attempting to replace any of that, and no serious scientist studying population genomics claims that it does. What genetics offers instead is a different kind of story, one operating on a much longer timescale, underneath the layer of recorded history, revealing how closely connected two seemingly distant populations actually are once you trace their biological roots back far enough. Perhaps the most important thing this research has settled again and again across studies and across decades is how little genetic distance actually separates human populations that look, on the surface, worlds apart. The 40,000-year-old skeleton from a cave near Beijing carrying genetic ties to ancient Europeans, the nearly identical percentage of ancient Neanderthal DNA quietly present in the genomes of people from Shanghai and people from Stockholm alike. The overwhelming statistical reality that most human genetic variation exists within populations, rather than between them. Each of these findings, arrived at independently through different methods by different research groups, keeps pointing toward the same underlying truth. Two people who look nothing alike, speak entirely different languages, and grew up worlds apart in culture and history, are, at the level of their DNA, carrying the record of the exact same ancient journey. So the next time someone frames Chinese and European populations as having emerged from entirely separate origins, worlds apart, remember what the actual evidence shows. Remember the shared corridor out of Africa. Remember the ancient bones in a cave near Beijing carrying a genetic signature that reaches all the way to Europe. Remember the nearly identical trace of Neanderthal DNA sitting quietly in genomes on both sides of the globe, inherited from the very same ancient encounter. The differences people notice on the surface, the ones so often treated as proof of separate, ancient, unrelated origins, are real, but they are also comparatively recent, comparatively shallow, and comparatively small next to the deep, shared history written into the human genome itself. Two branches, one tree, one long and remarkable journey that never really stopped connecting the people at either end of it, whether they realized it or not. Long before either group had a name for the other, they were already, in the most literal biological sense, family, and the DNA sitting quietly inside every cell of every person alive today is still carrying that ancient, unbroken thread forward.